So it's been a little while since I posted a podcast episode, but there's a good reason for that. And so today I'm going to briefly talk about that and then get into using the iPhone 12 Pro Max and why I think it is a great phone and also pretty underrated, believe it or not, at least in what I've seen coverage-wise on YouTube, Twitter, etc. Hey guys, Blake Calhoun, and this is another episode of Almost Professional, the podcast about mobile filmmaking, indie filmmaking, DIY filmmaking, really all things filmmaking. And today, talking about the iPhone 12 Pro Max and the benefits and the few negatives I've encountered after having the device for, I don't know, maybe 4 weeks, 6 weeks or so. I guess it's probably been about a month actually. So I'll get into that in just a second. My last episode I posted was Phoning It In with Mike Castellucci, and that was back at the end of October 20th actually. I'm recording this podcast about 2 months later, December 19th to be exact. And I took a little bit of time off, not only from the podcast, but also my YouTube channel. For the first time in about 2 years, I didn't post a video for 2 weeks in early November. And there's a reason for that. And that reason is, and I don't usually get too personal on my podcast or my YouTube channel. I talk about my work here and there and the pandemic and that kind of thing, but I'm not a vlog channel, as you know. I'm really more about, my channel is not about me. It's about storytelling, filmmaking, gear reviews, and that kind of thing. In saying that, hey, life gets in the way sometimes, and unfortunately, at the beginning of November, my father passed away unexpectedly. My dad died of a heart attack, again, unexpectedly. He had no issues in the past, and so it's the first close relative of mine to pass away. I've had grandparents die and had an aunt pass away, and all those are terrible, but when you have a parent pass away, it's a little bit different. It's just one of those things. He lived a good life. He was 79 years old. So that has had an impact on everyone in my life and has impacted me quite a bit. It's been a big change, and I'm still in the grieving process, to be honest. I think this takes a while. But in saying that, my YouTube channel in particular has been a great outlet to keep me busy and keep my mind on, work and staying busy and off the other stuff that you have to deal with a funeral and that kind of stuff. So that's why I've been a little bit absent from the podcast and then again from my YouTube channel for a few weeks there. But I'm back now, cranking out videos as fast as I can and really focusing recently on the iPhone 12 Pro Max. If you subscribe to my YouTube channel, which if you're listening to this podcast, you most likely do, and if you don't, definitely do that. You've seen that I've been doing a series of videos on the iPhone 12 Pro Max, and it's by far the best iPhone that's ever been made, and they say that every year, and this year it really is true. I guess it's true every year, but this year in particular it's true because and I'm talking about on the video side, I don't really care about the normal phone stuff. I mean, yeah, I use it as a phone too, and I'm actually recording my podcast on my iPhone as we speak here. But really, my main focus and my main interest in upgrading my phone has to do with the video camera, not even photography. Photography side is great, and they've made nice improvements year to year. But this year, the video stuff has really been what drew me to it. And if you're considering upgrading, here is why I think you should. Although I'm not telling you to upgrade, by the way. I want to make sure that's clear. If you're due for an upgrade, it's absolutely worth it, especially if you're a video-focused person with your smartphone. If you're not due for an upgrade, then that's a personal decision because it is a pricey device, and the iPhone 11 Pro Max is still great. The XS Max is still great. Before that, those are awesome phones, but if you have those devices and you're ready for an upgrade, then it's definitely time and worth it. And here's why. Not in any particular order at this point, but these are the top reasons that I have found the 12 Pro Max to be really good and making my life a lot easier shooting video with my phone. Number one is low light. And this is probably the biggest reason to upgrade this phone. It is actually what I would say good in low light now. And that is using the wide camera, not the ultra wide. The ultra wide is not good in low light. The wide camera is excellent in low light. I have been really surprised how good it is. And I'm talking again about video. A couple things going on. And I'm also talking about the 12 Pro Max. Let me be clear about that. The 12 Pro Max has the larger sensor. And so that makes a pretty big difference, a surprisingly big difference with the low light capabilities. That in combination with the wider aperture. It's now a 1.6, an f1.6. Compared to last year with the 11 Pro Max, it was an f1.8, which is still great, by the way. However, my first video I did was about low light, and you could see a marked difference between the 11 Pro Max and 12 Pro Max in the exact same lighting conditions, low lighting conditions. Huge improvement. And this is one of those things that I don't think has gotten enough coverage. I really don't. And maybe it's because a lot of people that use phones, especially on YouTube, aren't really using them in more serious, or how should I say, professional scenarios. They're using them to shoot social media or family videos and that kind of thing. And that's great. And you'll see a difference there too. But if you're using this phone to make a movie, to do YouTube videos where you're shooting in lower light, any kind of scenario, mojo, mobile journalism, the low light performance is really, I would say, night and day difference. It's that drastically better. Not that you couldn't use the 11 Pro Max before, but it would just be noisy in low light. And now I haven't really found a situation where I can't use it. I mean, within reason. It's not a Sony a7S III. Let's be clear about that, okay? You need light in the scene, but it does surprisingly well, in particular for a smartphone, and also compared to any and all devices before it. I would call it a legit option now for shooting even in low light. Now, keeping in mind, you still want to try to keep the ISO as low as possible, under 100 if you're using Filmic Pro. But even using the native camera app, I found it to be surprisingly good in low light. Number two, stabilization. Now again, this has not gotten really any coverage on YouTube. I think I may be the only channel out there that has actually showed, besides the Apple, in-house content, the promo video they did where they showed the camera mounted on the back of the car following those horses and it was shaking up and down. It will work like that. It is that good. I mean, with traditional cameras, it's tough to do that. And with any previous iPhone, it's literally impossible. Well, I shouldn't say any. Since the 7, I forget, maybe 8, maybe this is 6, I really do forget. The 6, I believe, the 6S was the last one that didn't have the OIS built in. And while optical image stabilization sounds like a great idea, and it is, it's a good idea, especially for photography, the way it's implemented in the iPhone, it is garbage when it comes to video stabilization. It doesn't work. Well, let me restate that. It works if you're just very subtly doing handheld. If you bounce the camera at all, even on a gimbal, you'll get these micro jitters that are not possible to fix in post-production and ruin your video. I've done numerous videos on my YouTube channel demonstrating this, so if you haven't seen that, check it out. It looks like that warbly, wobbly effect. But finally now, and again, on the wide lens only, and only on the Pro Max, you got this technology called sensor shift. And it more or less works like IBIS. It's not IBIS. IBIS has 5-axis, I believe, depending on which camera you're using. This is 2 or 3-axis. I really don't remember the exact details. All I know is it works surprisingly well. The biggest test I did was having it in my car, holding it against the vehicle and showing my dashboard, and it literally was shaking like you were in an earthquake. Without it, it was completely, obviously unusable. With it, it looked like you were driving down a smooth street. It is so good that it is a little bit mind-blowing, I gotta be honest. Again, I'm talking about from where we came from to where we are now. And as mentioned, this has not gotten really any coverage on YouTube. And I think, again, people either don't understand what it's doing or they don't use their phones in those type of situations. I do. And if you're listening to this and if you watch my channel, you probably do too. And what I'm talking about primarily is mounting your phone on your car or putting it on a slider dolly or even a little doorway dolly or a tabletop dolly. All those situations you could not do before. Now, I will say with the 11 Pro Max, you could finally do it with the ultra-wide lens, and the same thing still applies to the 12 Pro Max. The ultra-wide lens has no optical image stabilization. It's so wide you don't really need it, and that's great for video. And so you can get smooth stuff with the 11 Pro Max and the 12 Pro Max using the ultra-wide lens. But if you move to the wide lens, the 11 Pro Max is unusable. The 12 Pro Max, it works great. Right now, I'm actually testing this using gimbals. And so with gimbals, you're already shooting pretty smooth. And I did test it with handheld. There's not that big of a difference shooting handheld. There is some difference, especially if you step off a curb or, you're running or something. Just traditional handheld, you won't see that much of a difference. But if you do stuff that, again, where you're bouncing the camera or any kind of more adventurous shooting scenario, you will see a big difference. And that is a huge thing for me, again, using phones in a more professional way. And by the way, that means even using them as a B camera or a crash cam. Not that you'd want to crash an iPhone necessarily because it's pretty expensive, but in other words, using it as a second camera on a shoot. Maybe it is the stunt camera in a car or something, or you're just using a few seconds of the shot. This kind of technology makes a big difference and will really improve your footage. The third thing that, again, has gone underreported, way underreported, and I just did a video on this too. And by the way, I did a blog post, and I'll put a link in the show notes of this episode with links to all three of these videos in case you haven't seen them, and some commentary along the same lines about why these things are important for people wanting to use their phones in more professional shooting situations. And so I did a video on this topic, and that is shallow depth of field. Not something you usually think about when you're talking about smartphones, unless you put a depth of field adapter on, like from Bscript or Ulanzi. And those are fun, those can be cool, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about getting shallow DOF natively in the phone. And this works surprisingly well in the 12 Pro Max for two reasons, and on two lenses too. The wide lens, again, has the larger sensor, and it actually does make a pretty significant difference in the shallow depth of field abilities. And number two, the tele lens is a 65 millimeter. And so when you're shooting with that, the image is more compressed, and so you will see more shallow depth of field. And the really interesting thing is the aperture on the new 12 Pro Max on the tele lens is smaller. It's a 2.2 versus the f2 on the 11 Pro Max. However, in my testing, and I've heard some other people say the same thing, even though it is a smaller aperture, not only are you getting more shallow depth of field, and of course part of that is the longer lens, the 65 millimeter versus the 50, I believe is what the 11 Pro Max is. It also is just a better sensor, I'm assuming, because the low light capabilities have not changed. And if anything, it's actually better, which is just something you wouldn't think because, again, it's a f2.2 versus an f2. And then if you add a third-party lens like a Moment 58 millimeter tele onto the wide lens or on the tele lens, you can get shallow depth of field that rivals traditional cameras. Now, not full-frame cameras, okay, and not even really Super 35, more like Micro Four Thirds. But if you're on the end of the lens or if you're really closer to a subject, it can look like full-frame shallow depth of field. I'm not someone that believes shallow depth of field is the end-all be-all. It doesn't necessarily make something more, in quotes, cinematic. What I like about it, and it's what most filmmakers use it for, and I'm not talking about product B-roll or whatever. A lot of people overuse it, especially on YouTube and such. It can look cool though, don't get me wrong. But the main reason from a filmmaking perspective, narrative filmmaking is what I'm really talking about, is to isolate a subject from the background. And that is where iPhones in the past have struggled, and it hurts it in movies in particular. When everything is deep focus, I don't know, for me anyway, it doesn't ring true unless it's like 2001 Space Odyssey or something. Of course, those are shot on film. A lot of the Kubrick films, everything was shot very wide and everything was in focus. It worked in those situations. But for most things, it's nice to isolate a subject, whether it's a close-up of someone, I don't know, doing whatever they're doing in the movie, or even, and this is something that people equate it with today, it adds production value. And if you're shooting on a phone, adding production value, regardless of what it is, can be beneficial and help people not realize that you're shooting on a phone. I don't know if that makes sense, but not that there's anything wrong with shooting on a phone, not at all. But of course, you want to make it look as polished and as high production value as you possibly can. And that's one way to do it, and that's for sure. Now, I haven't tested out using the DOF adapter yet. I own a couple. I own the B-Script and the Ulanzi, and that is something I'm planning to do. But even without it, you can get some pretty good results. And to me, it's great. And one other thing, I'm talking about movies and narrative stuff. I know a lot of people use their phones in a mojo capacity. And so doing interviews, you can definitely get nice shallow DOF now using the 12 Pro Max. Again, natively using it, no adapters or anything, except it is nice to add maybe a third-party lens like from Moment or Sandmark or whatever. That can make a difference because, and I'll routinely have people ask me if you should even use third-party lenses today because lenses built into the phone are so great. And I always say, well, it just depends on what you're doing. But by using the best lens/camera on the iPhone, which is, and always has been, the wide, and putting a third-party lens on it, whether that's a telephoto or an ultra wide, you'll get the best results because the camera and sensor on that particular one are just better than the other two. Not only do they have wider aperture, in my experience, they're just more solid. And now again, with the 12 Pro Max, it's actually a larger sensor. And so a lot of benefits there. So those are my top positive reasons right now after using the phone for a month. There are some negatives though. And for me, at least, again, I haven't shot a ton, but I've shot enough to where I'm getting a feel for the device. And three things that are a little bit of a negative for me are, number one, the close focusing range, the macro. And really, it's not even macro, I've discovered. I thought it was only macro, but the 12 Pro Max, and I guess it's because of the larger sensor. And then I've heard also it could be because of the LiDAR sensor. You can't focus nearly as close as you could with a previous device, or even with the 12 Pro, I've heard, although I've heard there's issues with that one too. And so if that's the case, it could be the LiDAR sensor causing it. And that is, again, you can't focus up close. With the 11 Pro Max, you can put the phone right up against something and get an awesome macro shot. With the 12 Pro Max, I found you got to be 6 inches away, maybe further, depending on how big the object is. So that's a big change because of the way I'm used to working with a phone. The other day I was shooting some test footage of some flowers. And you know, when you're shooting on a phone, you're looking at the screen, oftentimes everything will look in focus and you get back in post-production and you're like, dang, it's out of focus. And that's even using focus peaking, by the way. Sometimes focus peaking, because it's contrast based, is not 100% accurate. And I'm talking about Filmic Pro and other apps too. If you didn't know that, that's been my experience. So definitely beware of that. But anyway, so the flower was about 6 inches or so from the camera, maybe even a little bit further, and it was not in focus. And I tried hard to get that in focus. And so that is a negative, but once you get used to it, it's just something that you learn to live with. And I have not tried a macro lens yet on the 12 Pro Max, and that is something I am going to try. So that could remedy this situation if you need to get those kind of shots. Number two for me is the size. The size is big, that's for sure. It's not that much bigger than the 11 Pro Max, but because the edges are square, it's a strange thing, but it really does feel a lot bigger in your hand compared to the 11 Pro Max. It's almost like an optical illusion, but for your hands. I know that doesn't really make sense, but side by side, they look very similar. The 12 Pro Max is maybe 1/8 of an inch bigger, but in your hand, it feels so much bigger. That can be good and bad, by the way, because I always have said for years, larger cameras are easier to work with. That's one thing I actually had to get really used to when I switched over to shooting with DSLRs and then mirrorless cameras because I came from more traditional, larger form factor cameras. Shooting with small cameras can be tricky, especially for getting smooth footage. I always wanted to add weight to them or put them in a cage or rig them out. And especially if you put them on a tripod, that way you can get smoother pans and smoother tilts and that kind of thing. Not quite the case here because the phones weigh pretty much the same. It's really more about holding it, and the larger phone, for whatever reason, has been a little bit of a change for me. Not a huge deal, but it is something that I've noticed, and I would call it a little bit of a negative. And especially if you carry your phone in your pants pocket like I do, my front pocket, it is noticeably bigger in your pocket. But the benefits outweigh the negative there because I can only assume the reason it's a larger device is because of the larger sensor, and the 3-camera setup is much larger than the previous generation phones. And so they just needed more space. So I really shouldn't complain about it because I've wanted a larger sensor in a phone for a while. And you always hear people say, well, there's only limited space inside the phone. So now they did it. And now I'm complaining about the size of the phone. But it is just something to get used to. And the only other thing that I've noticed, and I haven't done any real extensive testing with this, it's more anecdotal, but I feel like the 12 Pro Max, while the battery is good, it's not as good as the 11 Pro Max running Filmic Pro. At the end of the day or in the afternoon, if I've been out shooting, even doing test stuff, I feel like the 12 Pro Max is running out of battery before my 11 Pro Max did. And that can be a problem depending on how much you're shooting. I've always advocated having small portable batteries with you, little USB batteries, and I still do that. Haven't needed them as much the last couple of years because the phones have gotten so much better. I needed them a lot with the iPhone 8 Plus. That phone would last half a day or if that when you were shooting. The XS Max got much better, and the 11 Pro Max, that thing just never dies. I'm always amazed. 12 Pro Max, very good battery life, but not as good, at least in my experience, as the 11 Pro Max. So minor negatives here, but there are some things that if you do upgrade, you'll have to maybe adjust your thinking. So I'm sure this has been a lot to digest, but overall, if you are using your phone to make YouTube videos, to make indie films, short films, to do mobile journalism, and you're due for an upgrade, then I absolutely recommend getting a 12 Pro Max. It is a great device, and probably the number one thing you'll see a benefit from is the low light capabilities. And that's really been my biggest complaint about phones, really ever since I've used them. And the one thing I didn't mention that I'll talk about more in future episodes of this podcast and my YouTube channel, because I really haven't explored it as much as I need to, and that is shooting 10-bit and HDR in the native camera app and in Filmic Pro. And Filmic Pro has a lot of cool things coming under the hood very soon. As a matter of fact, when this podcast is released, it may already be released. But the 10-bit HDR really is amazing technology from Apple that third-party app developers like Filmic Pro are now implementing into their feature set and are really going to improve more of the post-production side. Although, of course, you'll see nice results just shooting video right inside your phone. But if you're going to take that into post and do color grading and visual effects or what have you, you'll really start seeing more benefits with this latest 10-bit technology. And that is another big reason to upgrade, though, because all that stuff you hear me talk about or other advancements, and by the way, that means in LumaFusion as well, only apply to the iPhone 12 and going forward. So older devices, that does not apply. But as you can tell, I'm very excited about this new phone. The phrase game changer is thrown around a lot, and I've used it myself, and this is a game changer. It really is. And the craziest thing is this technology is also new, and it's early days, and so it's only going to get better. Again, as mobile filmmakers or just filmmakers in general, I really believe more traditional filmmakers, I'm a traditional filmmaker, I make my living mainly as a traditional filmmaker, will be embracing this technology more and more. And so look for more coverage about the iPhone 12 Pro Max on my YouTube channel and again on this podcast in the future. Lots of cool stuff in store for 2021. Can't wait to get out of 2020. This has been a pretty crappy year for a lot of reasons. But there's also been some good stuff come out in 2020. So it is the weird best of times, worst of times dichotomy. Oh, one other thing. Last year I did a top 10 list of my favorite mobile filmmaking gear of 2019. I don't think I'm going to do that this year. I had planned on it, but with everything going on, and then I really haven't tested as much gear this year as I probably should have or could have, reviewed it. And so I'm not sure I'm going to do that. I might do my top 5 favorite things, but I just wanted to let you know that that is something I was considering doing, but I may not be doing now. I've got about 10 days or so left in this year to figure that out. And so I might do it, but if I do, it will be a little bit different than I did last year. And that was a pretty popular video, I have to say. And I did that on my podcast as well. So if you've gotten this far into this episode, I appreciate you listening. I hope you have a great holiday season if I don't do another podcast before the end of the year. And if I do, well, I'll talk to you then. But otherwise, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year. I'm Blake Calhoun, and this has been another episode of Almost Professional. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your support, and I will talk to you in the next episode.